Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final day of Ideal 22. Thanks so much for being here. I'm looking in the chat area. I see Bayla is in, lots of folks, Sarah Krutz, Megan Corley, Taylor. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on this final day. So we've got two sessions today. We've got Devin Torres here to talk about inclusive assessment design. And then later this afternoon at 12 o'clock p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern, we've got Terry Rice and Kim Flannery Rye discussing DEI beyond traditional learning and development. So that one is going to close out the day. So today, though, I'm so intrigued by this topic that Devin is generous enough to share with us. Inclusive assessment design. We were just talking a little bit about this stuff before in the green room before we started. But let me tell you a little bit about Devin if you don't already know about her. Devin is an instructional designer at 280 Group, as well as the owner of Torres Content Creation. She's somewhat of a new instructional designer. Do you still think you're a new instructional designer, Devin?
I'm still going to consider myself a newbie. Yeah.
Because it seems like I've known you for a while now.
I know.
Devin has been developing curriculum and assessment for K through 12 and higher ed for 9 years. She's passionate about equitable and relatable e-learning and distance education, and leveraging data and ed tech to deliver experiences that best fit the learner need. Great supporter of TLDC. Devin is always helping and attending and just really supporting this community all around. In 2021, she launched Torres Content Creation in order to develop and grow in the e-content space, adapt to a changing work world, and leave something for her daughter for the future, which is something that I found interesting with this event is that I've heard other people say the same thing, where the reason that they are wanting to work in the DEI space and are focused on these topics and these stories is to leave something for their children. And that's definitely where I am with that as well. So with that, please welcome Devin. I'm going to go ahead and hide myself from the stage and Devin, let you take over.
All right. Thank you so much. That was a great bio. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So I tend to talk a little bit fast when I get nervous. If I need to slow down, just shoot me a notification in chat. I have two screens going right now, so I'm looking over here for a presentation and looking at here for chat. So if I look like I'm going back and forth, I am. But to get started, my name is Devin Torres. I am a biracial Black woman. I have my hair in a bun today, my headset on, and my standard work uniform, which is this like really comfy cardigan from Kohl's and a pink shirt. And today I'm going to talk to you about inclusive assessment design. So I like to start these presentations a little bit about myself, both professionally and personally, because I feel like it feels better to know who you're talking to. So I'm Devin. I'm an instructional designer and curriculum developer. We're playing with titles right now at 280 Group, and I do have a business, Torres Content Creation, where I started during the pandemic, just trying to get into the field, and I still take some freelance stuff. Yes, Bella, I am a mom to Kid Kat and Plant, and I love all of them. I'm an anime fan, a Final Fantasy fan, super excited. December 15th, the second part of the 7 remake comes out. I'm a biracial Black woman, which is important to this conversation. And most importantly, I love assessment. And I want to tell some professional pieces of that, and then I want to talk about personally why I'm doing this today or talking about this with you today. When I say I love assessment, sometimes I get this visceral reaction, right? Because I worked in K-12, I worked in higher ed, and sometimes when we hear assessment, we go, oh, standardized testing. And I am one of those people that goes, ugh, standardized testing, right? So show of hands, how many people that are listening in today do a lot of work with assessment? You can use the little emoji hands. It may not be any. Okay. um, I see a couple popping up. So that's why I want to talk about this. I think in the opener of this session, I had said we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion and equity and accessibility in our course design or our content design, but I don't often hear about it talked about in assessment. And because I love assessment and I am a data person and I'm into that, I do try to kind of focus in on those areas. And in my personal experience, I worked for an underrepresented student program called DeSouza Brent Scholars. It was very data driven. It was a grant funded program that was data driven, and so we did a lot of exploration about retention numbers for underrepresented students. And one thing that my supervisor, FJ Talley, always said to me was, the data tells a story, right? And DB told some amazing stories with their data. They were students that were underrepresented, but being retained at a higher rate than non-underrepresented students. And even when those students left our institution for whatever reason, they were still successful in completing a program. And that was a really interesting story to get to share with people. And when I started thinking, okay, data always tells a story, I loved it. I love books. I love stories. A lot of presentations this week have talked about stories and the diversity in stories and why it's important to tell them. The other thing that it prompted me to think is, well, where are we getting that data? Because data comes from somewhere, right? And we can share data in a diverse way, in an accessible way, in an inclusive way, but are we collecting it in the same way? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. I'm an assessment nerd. I love it. Okay. So Kayleen did this in her presentation, and I wanted to kind of mirror. I do have a personal why for talking about this. So on the screen, you will see a drop-down box with race listed. American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, white, and declined to provide. I was born in 1990. I did a lot of census stuff. I remember filling out applications for scholarships for college and things like that. And I am biracial. And it used to be, I think when I was super little, there was no box for me, right? Yes, Bella, I don't align with any of them. I'm also biracial, right? So there, at first there wasn't a box at all. And then my mom is great. She works for an educational organization. And when I was 16, I went to a conference with her, and I did check in. It was for like a service project for high school. And I'm looking at these categories, and I see that it's other. And it wasn't the other that sometimes we get now, where it's other and a short answer, and you can type in, what you identify with. It was just other. And I was like, Mom, and my mom is great. She's amazing. And she's a really strong ally for me. My mom is white. And I'm like, Mom, this doesn't feel good. Like saying other doesn't feel good. And I'm 15 or 16. And I remember watching other participants check in, and I would get their form and I would see that they would say other. And we had a dialogue around it. Like, how does that make you feel? And it wasn't good, right? Other can be good, but sometimes there's a negative connotation that comes with other. And so that is one thing that always stuck out to me about, forms or things like that. We use these fields and they can be very limiting to people. On the right of the screen, you will see a hyphen. Before I got married, my last name was Holt Zimmerman. It was hyphenated, combination of my mom's last name and my dad's last name. And I remember going to vote or filling out any type of online form for a credit card or a financial institution. And the hyphen was not a thing that was recognized. They didn't accept it. But my last name isn't Holt space Zimmerman, it's Holt hyphen Zimmerman. And if anyone has filled out like a customer service form or any type of HR form, if you can't get past like the name fields, it's very frustrating. And when people are frustrated, yes, when people are frustrated, I'm guilty of this, even as a data person. I'm mad, so I fill out the survey inaccurately or with frustration, and it's not really representative of the information that I want to provide, but I'm frustrated because I can't get past the welcome screen. And that's annoying. And I think about my daughter who can't even put my surname for my banking. Yes. So I think about my daughter who is multiracial. My husband is white and Bolivian, and I am white and Black. And I think about her and I'm like, oh, that's going to be annoying. And my daughter has 4 names, one first, 2 middle, 1 last. And I think about how we tend to design these forms and these assessments, these demographic questions in a way that is traditional maybe to us, right? But not traditional across the board. And we'll talk about that moving forward. Um, but those are my personal whys. And like Louise said, I've heard a lot about wanting to, do these things and be involved in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for their kids. And my daughter is my driving force behind the work I do and behind the things I do. And so I want her to feel included, and I want her to be able to fill out a form and not be extremely frustrated or answer questions that are not isolating or frustrating. So that's a little bit of my personal why. And now I want to talk about what happens with non-inclusive assessment, and then we're going to talk about examples of the problem and how we can do better. So professionally speaking, what happens with non-inclusive assessment is you get bad data in, you get bad data out. So we collect data and we don't do it right. When we visualize this data and share this data and analyze this data, it's also not going to be representative, right? We can get skewed visualization and misrepresentation because we're telling stories. And if we're taking data in and we're not capturing all the voices, or we're capturing them in a way that isn't inclusive, we're also misrepresenting the story. So that's important. And the most practical one, when we don't design assessment to be inclusive, we drive ourselves to design something that doesn't support the objectives or to solve the problem of the learner or user. We have to look at the culture and the makeup of the organizations we're serving, right? If we're asking the wrong thing or we're isolating people from answering, we're not addressing everybody in the issue. And on a more personal note, and these are the ones that are extremely important to me, it makes people feel insignificant, unseen, and unheard. They don't feel represented. And when you don't feel represented, like, it feels bad, right? Like it's to feel invalidated. So for me, to not be able to select my race, to not be able to enter my name in a form, I filled out assessments and surveys and questions where I don't comprehend the question, or I can't answer the question because it's not culturally relevant to me or experientially relevant to me. And to me, it screams, well, I can't even fill this out, so my voice doesn't matter. It can also end up perpetuating a dangerous false narrative, and we'll talk about some of the methodologies and how that's happened before. And it also takes away access. It may be a small barrier, but it does take away access to a bigger thing. And when we talk about inclusion, it's about access. It's about feeling represented and being able to access content and feel safe in the space, right? So broke it down into 3 parts: structure, content, and concept. So I'm going to use this lovely graphic of a laptop to talk about the different structural pieces of assessment and evaluation that I think we can do better with as far as inclusion, or at least areas where I see issues. And again, these are personal areas where I've seen issues. If you see them in the chat, I would love you to share. And I'm just going back to the chat. When we don't have diversity in the design room, people don't even realize what might be inaccessible for others who are different from them. Correct. So as a designer, I get to, especially as an assessment designer, I get to have this like back end control, right? The ability to make sure that we are asking the right things and we are being inclusive. So for structure, I want to start with fields. We just talked a little bit about it. For me, it was racial fields and sometimes the name fields, but there are other issues within fields that are limiting. When you have fields and you don't have options for other, so you have other, but there's no option to add additional information, you will miss information. If people don't fit in this list or this checkbox, they can't identify, or they pick an identity that they might not really identify with, and then that's misrepresentative of who they are as a person. Tati says, you don't know what you don't know. I've only recently needed accessibility features and realized how limited my own designs were in the past. Yes, I've learned so much just from this conference, and we're continuing to learn every day. And to that point, I am not the writer and the expert of this. This is just something that I've experienced. So please, take all of this and pair it with more learning as we move forward. But for fields, when we do these drop downs, and they are select answers, we isolate people, right? Because they can't fill them out. Additionally, sometimes there are limitations. So I've seen fields where last name has to be more than 3 letters. I have a friend whose last name is Sue, S-U. That is not 3 letters, and the field is required. And when it's required, you can't move forward. So those requirements that maybe culturally to us seem like they make sense, it's not it doesn't culturally make sense everywhere. And so when we are designing these things, we have to think about the audience, especially, I'm US based. So I think internationally, are we putting limitations on people by only including what we know? Of course. The other thing is, we do a lot with sex and gender and things like that, and we put very limited option, or we don't include a space for people to expand on other, or we just group other and people see other. And again, like I said, it felt bad to me at 15 and 16, would still feel bad to me now at 32. It's just limiting. And so I think with fields, we just have to be careful. We have to look outside of what we know. We have to continue to stay up to date on best practices for that. And yes, you can never underestimate the impact of these things, even with something as simple as accents on particular letters. Yes, that any type of, and I don't like using this because non-traditional in my world is not necessarily non-traditional in another, but any type of non-traditional character or spacing can limit somebody from moving forward in like the first question. So definitely things we want to keep an eye on, but fields are an area where I see this come up a lot. Additionally, video and audio accessibility. So we use a software where we can incorporate video and audio into our assessments, and I've seen it done in other places. You stick a video in an assessment, you want somebody to watch it and then answer a question, or you stick an audio in. I've seen audio done for pronunciation and things like that. And one of the things that I've ran into is just the accessibility of the video and audio. There are standards for the accessibility of video and audio through web, and I'm mostly speaking through web today, about web assessment today. But I see people who are just like, well, I pulled the video off YouTube and it's absolutely fine, and it's not fine. Or the intent is good. We talk about intent versus impact. The intent is give participants more engagement, give people a way to access the content differently. But it's more than just intent, it's impact. Because now we've said, okay, here's alternative ways to access the content or the question, and then it may be another barrier for somebody. Maybe the visual isn't accessible, the audio isn't accessible. So now this person has experienced 2 barriers on the way to try to answer a question and to move forward. And I want to talk about branding a little bit too. This is a Burger King ad. Women Belong in the Kitchen is like on a white screen with a red background. It's like a very bold text. And again, we talk about intent versus impact. The intent was that we need more women in the culinary profession. The impact of reading Women Belong in the Kitchen was not well received. So when we talk about branding, especially in assessment, whether we partner with somebody or we do our own design of branding, like with colors and things like that, we want to make sure we are using language and jargon that isn't this, right? It's a really jarring statement. And again, intent versus impact, here we are. So I think my thing with branding is just being aware of how we're using words, how we're making statements, and with no context in an assessment, like if it's just stuck up in a corner or it's just an image, it one, is it adding anything or giving anything to participants? But two, if I saw that in a corner and I'm filling out a survey because I'm interested in a culinary program, and say they partnered with Burger King and Women Belong in the Kitchen is the thing I'm seeing on the right, I'm not going to continue to fill it out. Especially with no context. And as you can see in this ad, the context writing is very, very small. So the large jarring wording is enough to turn somebody off and away from it. And additionally, we've all seen the color scheme where it's like purple background and lime green text and impossible to read and in horrible font. So while you're customizing assessments or you're trying to give an edge to them, you want to make sure people can actually access them to fill them out and do them. And the big thing I really wanted to talk about today is methodology, and this is where we're going to spend a lot of time. So on the screen is a quote from Brandeis Marshall, who just led a Black Women in Data Summit that was amazing. But she also wrote Data Conscience, Algorithmic Siege on Our Humanity. And it's one of my favorite books right now, and I'm shamelessly plugging it. I think it's very good. And one of the things that she says is, attempts to make eugenics legitimate through scientific and data-rich, rigorous methods is a long-standing approach since the opening of the Eugenics Research Office in 1910, and it continues to this day. And the reason I wanted to use that quote is because we trust the math. What I have noticed is when we do assessment or any type of analysis, we always trust the math, right? Because it's math. Math can't be inherently biased, right? Before I hopped on, yes, definitely recommend buying. Before I hopped on here, Luis and I were talking about this, but Bella is actually the person that had shared it on LinkedIn, and I saw it. I talk about Myers-Briggs all the time. I don't know that I've ever actually taken one, but I've taken something similar to, kind of suss out my best skills in career development when I worked in a career center. And I saw this post on LinkedIn from Bella about how Myers-Briggs was extremely problematic, but doing more research, it's racist and sexist. And I'm thinking, like, what? Myers-Briggs? Everybody does it? Or, I mean, everybody did it back in the day, right? And then I did the research, and it should seem obvious to me that something that was developed when it was, in the time period it was, by the person it was, could have inherent bias in it. But we trust the math all of the time. And even in thinking, oh, here we go. This is a quote directly from Myers. Multitudes of people are utterly worthless or worse than worthless, having no just claims whatsoever upon the civilization which they burden with the dead weight of their existence. So just sit with that and think, have you ever taken a Myers-Briggs exam? Because that is the person who designed that methodology. That is what that person thinks of people, right? Another good example of methodology that I want to use, and this one is personal, is the vaginal birth after cesarean score. So I have a daughter, and I did not have a cesarean section, and I was very worried about getting one because I was nervous that we had some stuff. And so I started doing research, right? And I was like, oh, there's a VBAC score. And I looked, and so I had my daughter in 2020. And yes, I remember VBAC scores. So there's a category in the methodology. Are you African American or Hispanic? And that impacts the score that you have for a successful vaginal birth after cesarean. Like, what's the risk, right? Yeah. And that African American Hispanic calculation wasn't removed until 2021. So a year ago. So for all these years, all of these deliveries, all of these births, this was the calculation that was being used to determine, is it worth the risk? As a biracial Black woman who has had poor medical care experience, I look at these things and I wonder, how many people were forced into a type of delivery that wasn't ideal for them because of the score. And what was the reasoning behind, including these factors? Because at the end of the day, they removed it in 2021, meaning this, basis on being Black or African American and Hispanic wasn't a valid point, but they were building it into a calculation. And so we use so much AI and software today, and that's, partially what this book is about. We use so much AI and software to, work with our assessment because it's quick and it's supposedly more accurate because, again, for the 500th time I'll say this, we trust the math. But who's developing the math? Who are the people developing the math? Are they the people that they're asking the question of? Are they the people that they're serving? So methodology is something that I'm like digging into because I work at a company where we do assessments and things like that. And we use a software. And luckily for us, when we get a spit out, we analyze it ourselves. It's not just spit it out, read it. We do more research. And I want to ask people, show of hands, how many people have used a software or use a software in their assessment when they collect data and they want to present the numbers to learners or to organizations? How many people use a software instead of doing that calculation manually? A couple hands. Right. Because sometimes it's not feasible to go through thousands and thousands and thousands of data points. So we trust the methodology, we trust the math, we trust the algorithm, but what happens if those things are inherently biased? Well, then so is our output. So just things to keep in mind. And, again, I'm not saying go back to your organizations and throw the software out the window and do everything by hand. I'm terrible at math. I rely on Excel for pretty much anything I do involving analysis. And I often ask people at the end of our meetings to calculate our rating scores for me because I'm that bad. But when I see a bell curve, when I see our data, I always want to dig more, especially when I see outliers. And that's the other thing I want to talk about in methodology. How many people, when they see outlier information, dig for more? Okay. How many people, when they see an outlier, say, that's an outlier? It happens. And that's not a wrong answer, by the way. Yep, that's what we hear most. Yep. So sometimes we have an outlier, it's there, everybody's like, oh, everybody gets some wonky data points, and they don't follow up. And what they may miss is a problem with the methodology, a problem with the algorithm, maybe some question wasn't working. Depends on time capacity to investigate and if the org cares enough to look deeper. Extremely valid point. And that's what I want to talk about today. Sometimes there's just not capacity. I know that I've worked in really big organizations where we did have a quality assurance person, a team actually, and there was the capacity to say something isn't looking right. And I know as an individual, because I had a background in analysis, when I see something that doesn't really make sense, I as an individual can look into it. But like you said, if the organization doesn't care to support the deeper learning or the deeper investigation, and they say, hey, we'll put the report out, what can you do? Right? So there are, moving forward, we're going to talk about a couple of things, small things, right, that we can do when we're building these tools, when we're doing these assessments and sharing them, to make it a little bit better, a little bit more inclusive, and maybe avoid some of the issues that we just talked about. So I want to talk about content. There's a lot of ways where we exclude people from the content we're evaluating. So formatting of questions is an interesting one. Not everybody can answer questions the same way or interprets questions the same way. So sometimes I'll take a quiz or an assessment or something, and I'll have an answer, and it's a multiple choice. And what I'm in my head thinking or saying, I'm like, this is the answer. It's not listed. And there's no option for other, right? Now, I'm not saying questions like, what is 2 plus 2? And I'm sure there is somebody who could argue that if I say the answer is 4, then I'm wrong, right? But I'm talking about some of these questions like the strongly disagree and strongly agree questions, or when you're taking, like, you're filling out a hiring form and they ask you, what would you do in this scenario, and they give you this scenario and there's 3 options, and I see ones that say vote, pick the one that is closest to the best response to you. On format, questions that refer to images like hotspot type questions or map location selections are certainly very challenging. I'm an overthinker, so questions like this can be anxiety inducing. Yes. When there's questions that are like subjective or like objective, right? Subjective, objective. But if there's questions that could have multiple answers or the answer isn't extremely clear, when you have a limited response and you're an overthinker, it is anxiety inducing and it makes it hard to answer. And especially, so again, I worked in K-12. We had standardized testing. I remember like going through the program with the kids because we would do this pre-prep for PARC assessment. And my student had an answer, 4th graders. Student had an answer. It was right, but he needed to dig a little deeper, get a little more context, and then I think he would have came to one of the listed answers. But there was no short answer for this question. And he got really upset because he knew what the answer was. He was right there. But that standardized question option with these very, these 4 multiple choice, it wasn't giving him the answer in a way he needed. And he got mad and he walked out and he didn't finish. And it made him not want to come back to the program because that's a frustrating experience. It's very frustrating for, younger kids. It's extremely frustrating for adults too. I've had to answer diversity questions or campus climate questions where I feel very boxed in my answer. Like, well, what would you rate the campus? Or they'll give you an example like, the campus meets my needs in ways of inclusion and diversity. Strongly disagree, strongly agree, somewhat agree. And what is that telling us? Like, there's no more explanation to follow. And to me, as someone who analyzes these things, I'm like, okay, you're going to get all these little data points, but you're not going to, there's no short answer with these questions. You're not going to get the experiences of people. So if someone says, I mostly agree, you don't know why they don't strongly agree. Or if someone says, I strongly disagree, you don't know what the problem is. So making sure we're formatting questions, especially those type of questions, in a way that give people the opportunity to provide more detail. That means we get more detail, and that means we can tell a better story. Is our content realistic for participants? So are we giving examples and asking questions, especially scenario questions, or even imaging questions? Are we providing participants and the group taking it with things that are realistic to them? I remember talking to someone who didn't know what a FAFSA was, hadn't really had to use one. And we were talking about just like the process. And to me, I was amazed. I'm like, you've never had to fill out a FAFSA? Like, everyone has to do this. Not everyone has to do that. And, you know, it was an assumption that I had. And so I think about, if I was designing an assessment to support, educational financial support curriculum or something like that, and I asked this person a question about FAFSA and they got it wrong, well, yeah, because they've never been involved with one. But there are tons of times where we take tests or quizzes or assessments where the question we're asking is just not realistic for us, and so how do we answer it effectively? Now, if you put NA, it's not applicable to you. Well, that also tells a story that it's not applicable. And then maybe you can take that NA and improve that question if you get, a statistically significant result. But if you don't, then you have people just picking stuff that C seems like a good thing to pick all the time, right? They pick C, and then your data is skewed, all kinds of stuff. So along with being realistic, is it culturally relevant? You know, I'm from the US, so I always make the joke that, not everything is US based, because I see so many things that are a US concept, right? Like, oh, for example, Thanksgiving. I work with clients who don't celebrate Thanksgiving. And it's like, oh, happy Thanksgiving. I'm not working, so I'm sure you're not working, so I'm not going to respond to things for 7 days. And there was no indication, right? Like, that there would be a communication break because this is our holiday and maybe not theirs. Examples work, the questions and examples work the same way. So if someone has never experienced a concept or doesn't understand a concept and you ask them a question about it, what are they supposed to do? Do they guess? And you don't give them an option to say not applicable, or an option to explain more, or an option even in like support to ask a question like, hey, I don't understand this. That's a problem. So I've seen things where they'll give a cultural example of something and they do like a little blurb to explain what that is, and then the person can better answer those questions. But that's not always an option. It's not always the case. And then linguistics. So language. I've seen a lot of this in the chat, and I talk about this a lot. How many people work or have worked with an organization that uses a lot of acronyms or jargon? Tech, yes. Yes. So I see a lot of hands. So when I made the transition from higher ed to corporate, there's no dictionary and DOJ. And my colleagues would use these acronyms. And the thing I really love about the team I work with is, even if someone is consistently using acronyms, there's always someone to say, hey, please define that for new people. And I love that. But when I started, I remember hearing the term grok like 100 times. I had no clue what that meant. We legit have 13 pages of acronyms. Yes, we are tech. But yes, grok was always one that got me. And I'm a nervous person. Like, I never wanted to go to my boss and be like, what is everyone saying? What is a grok? And then I'm Googling it during meetings, and Urban Dictionary is like a blessing and a curse, right? Get some interesting stuff on there. So I finally just had to ask. And then when I figured out what it was, I was like, oh, okay, now it's does it work? Do I get the concept? But that was a barrier for me in conversation. And so, we design these trainings and we teach people, and I see a lot of times we'll define the word, we'll have the acronym in the training, and then you get to the assessment and it's like, define EOB. And I'm like, what? So, libraries, yes. And, so we don't think about that when we're making our quizzes at the end, or we're doing our initial intake analysis and we have terminology that's familiar to us, but not to other people. Additionally, and it's so funny to me, I see that we do a lot of work to be inclusive in our language in courses and content. So I'm a fan of the universal they, right? And I see that we get to the assessment portion, and sometimes it is there are like questions rooted in stereotypes. They're non-inclusive language, or the language is very business formal. That's another one I love. Like we'll teach a whole course and have like very lax language, very normal conversation language, and then we get to the assessment and it's like extremely formal. And I'm like, I don't know what this is. What? Like, please explain. So also, when you're designing an assessment, and say you have you're an international place and you're designing an assessment and you send it out, and all of your courses can translate to different languages through software, but your assessment doesn't, and that's in English, and your participant can't take it because everything else was translated, but not this piece. That's a problem, and you just lost that participant's information and potentially interest. Because I think one of the other things I want to reiterate is assessment often to me feels like it's separate from the course. I feel like sometimes in an ideal world, we build it together, right? We build it together. But sometimes you've spent months on a course, it's the end of the day, you throw a bunch of questions into SurveyMonkey for, rating the course and things like that, and you're like, good to go. I did it. It's done. But think about how you use that data after. So, we have to be intentional when we're building these things. It's not just assessment is a separate thing you tack on at the end. Like diversity and inclusion are not separate things you tack on at the end. And my last proof point is the concepts. So this is my other favorite thing to talk about. When we're designing assessments and evaluations and things like that, do we have a clear understanding of what we are asking and why we're asking it? I use hiring as an example. I remember, and I've seen this a couple places, we have like a diversity, we had not at the organization I'm with now, but previously we had a diversity statement about hiring. We had all these things in place, and we had to write statements when we didn't hire a diverse candidate. All these things in place. And I remember being in a meeting and somebody saying, well, we're having a really hard time attracting diverse candidates. And I'm like, okay, we're a PWI. It happens. What's our marketing look like? What are we asking? What is our salary ranges? All types of things. But additionally, the other question to ask with that is, why, when we're selecting candidates, is it always this candidate? So there's two sides to these questions. And like any problem solution space, you want to drill down to what is the real problem, and that involves asking multiple questions to get to the right thing. So making sure, like, when we're doing these assessments, we understand what we're asking will help us design better for the organizations and the people that we're serving. What are our hypotheses rooted in? We all have bias, right? We all do. We work to be better, but we all have it. And when we're testing something, when we're asking for data, in our heads, we have an idea of what things will be. But when we let our hypotheses, when we look at the data through the lens of our hypotheses and it's rooted in, well, I have to be right, or I know this is right, or it aligned with my hypotheses, this must be true, we're not being representative in our stories. So we have to look at where our predictions are rooted in. Are they coming, from statistical significant scores? Are they coming from data, or are they coming from, well, I know a guy? Because a lot of the times we make a hypothesis because we know a guy, or we get an answer that supports our hypothesis and it's one answer and we're like, data point of one, we're running with it, it's good. It's not good. Bella is saying consult a data horse for guidance, because the other day, side note, I have to tell this story though. My daughter has a Jurassic Park coloring book. She kept running up to me and she was saying, data horse, data horse. And I was like, data horse? What is this data horse content? Like, what is this concept? What are we doing? Are we being data fast, data driven? She was saying dinosaur, but I was very, very excited about it. So there's a clip of it on my Instagram of her just going, I'm like, say dinosaur, data horse. And I love it. That's her new nickname. So I wanted to share that. The next thing, have we evaluated the impact and are we transparent? And these two things go together for me. I'm also going to use a student example. Data for the sake of data is sometimes not a good thing. I'm sure we can think of 1,000 places that has been the case. I'm going to use pronouns and name change for this example. I did not say this in the beginning, but my pronouns are she, her, hers. And my only name change has been in marriage. So this is not directly impacting me, but I have seen it directly impact students, for example. I was doing some career data at some point in my life, and I remember somebody saying, we don't have any data on our trans students. And I was like, oh, do we ask that question? And they were like, no. When I was like, oh, should we ask that question? Not because I don't want to be representative of a population, but is it safe for students to answer that question? What do we do with that data? How is it protected? Because not everybody is out, and even with name change for international students, it was definitely a process, but it was also a process for any of our students who had changed their name for other reasons. And so we have to evaluate the impact of what we are asking, because although well-intended to be inclusive, it can also be extremely harmful. Even with things like, racial identity data, ethnicity data, depending on how it's used, it can be harmful for people to have to answer those questions. Or what we do with that information can be harmful to other people. So I think we have to think about that as we design these assessments and ask these demographic questions. And same thing with the questions themselves. And are we transparent with how we're using the data and what we're doing with the assessment? Everything typically has a privacy clause nowadays. I like it, but I also like to be honest. And I have been in situations where it's like, who has eyes on this data? And I'm like, well, it's my eyes, it's their eyes, it's their eyes. And someone above me says, it's only your eyes, not in the organization I'm at now, but in previous lives. It's only your eyes. But that's not transparent and that's not honest. I know it's not always an easy thing to do because, NDAs are a thing. But I try to be as transparent as I can about what we are doing with the information out, like after we gather it, how we came up with the scale, how we came up with the need to ask certain questions. I think that's important for people. Because if a question is hard to answer or uncomfortable or isolating, we should be honest about why we are asking it. And if the response is it's harmful and we find it's unnecessary, why keep the question, right? I'm going to be mindful of time. Core design principles: knowing your audience helps you design a better assessment. Knowing the problem you are trying to solve for, or the data you are trying to get, and knowing the organization and the culture of the people you are trying to serve helps you design better for them. It helps you be more inclusive, and it makes sure that you are capturing the bigger voice for the bigger story. Being authentic, that goes back to the realistic questions, realistic examples, realistic expectations. When you know your audience, and it's easier to parse out what questions, statements, and experiences can be considered authentic, it's easier to design that way, and it's easier to tell their story that way. And then using technology and using it wisely. Again, we talked about algorithm bias in software. Know who you're partnering with. We're telling stories, so make sure we're telling them accurately. And what else can we do? And these are the small things I think we can build into everyday assessment to be a little bit better. Stay up to date on best practices, and not just in inclusive design, but the WCAG standards. Um, you know, it's more than just building out the questions; it's the asset you use in the designs. Join in community discussions like this. The TLDC does a lot of these, and they're always informative and helpful. So you can learn a lot. Check out brands' diversities and inclusion statements and actions. This is big for the software we use for assessment and design. A lot of brands have diversity statements. Sometimes they don't do a lot of action with them. I'm sure we can all mentally think of like 55 right now, especially those of us who work in tech. So take a look, see what people are doing. And this is my favorite one. Ask. Ask your stakeholders, ask your clients, ask the people you're serving. One of the things that 280 Group has put into practice, which I'm so excited about, is asking our stakeholders what representation they want to see. What are their diversity needs? What are their needs for their organization, so that not only when we design our courses, when we design their assessment, we're using inclusive language. We're asking questions that make sense to them. We're making sure we can capture all these voices. And so we have about 7 minutes left. I want to open this for conversation because I want to hear what other people have experienced. But I hope you took some good things away from this presentation. I was super excited about it. Always super excited to talk about data with anybody. So yeah, I would love to hear any thoughts. I guess another aspect related to accessible assessments is to give options or choice. For example, can we offer different formats of assessment to support learner variability? CAST UDL offers some specific guidelines on this. Thank you for sharing that information. And yes, I love that. I love the option of choice. Thank you for sharing the link. One of the things I really like as we talk about assessment, especially in the concept of hiring, I feel like hiring comes up a lot, like the questionnaires and formats like that. I remember reading an article about hiring interviews and neurodiverse candidates, and we ask questions that can sometimes be hard to answer, and so people have leaned into like portfolio based interviewing and things like that. And I know that does come with its own negative connotation of I'm doing work and I should be paid for my work. But when we're designing assessments, there's no harm in giving a short answer option, giving an option for people to explain, or even in your support, like your customer support, learner support, making sure they can ask questions so that they can get more information to answer accurately. You want the best data that you can get from people because you want to tell the best representative story. At least in my mind, you do, right? So the more access people have to these assessments, the more easy and relatable and honest people can be when they take them, the better story you're going to get to tell with your data. Bella said, if any of you'd like to go down a rabbit hole to learn more about Myers-Briggs, here's one to get you started. Definitely go down that rabbit hole. Do it, because you will be amazed. I was in shock. I literally, for weeks, have been like, we can combine this type of assessment with like a Myers-Briggs strategically. And then I realized I had said that so much, and I'm like, I gotta find a new test, gotta find a new assessment. This is bad. So definitely some interesting stuff. Also, one more time, I am gonna plug Brandeis Marshall's Data Conscious Algorithm, the Siege on Our Humanity book. I will actually stop sharing and look that up so I can put the link in the chat now for you. Let's see. But I'm going to put the link on Amazon, but feel free to order from your local bookseller because it always makes me happy. But that's a link to the book. Super informative, very good. And again, host the Black Women in Data Summit this year. It's the first time. It was amazing. 10 out of 10 recommend. I have never felt more seen in my life, and that's part of the reason I'm speaking to you all today. So
Devin, great session. You're good at this.
What?
Yeah, you are. You are really good at this. I mean, I already knew that, I guess, but I'm like, wow, it's just fantastic. You should do this more often.
I will. Thank you.
Great work. Let's see. I'm just checking to see if there are any questions in the Q&A. Not seeing anything. Yeah, Toddy saying this was a really useful presentation, thought-provoking. Yeah.
Aww. Well, thank you all so much.
Totally appreciate you, Devin. Let's say I just want to remind everybody at 12 o'clock, we have Kim Flannery Rye and Terry Rice coming in for our last session of the week. DEI, Beyond Traditional Learning and Development. This one's sort of interesting. It seems like it's a session that we probably could have opened the event with. So it's good that we're closing out with it. So make sure you come back in an hour or so and help us wrap up this incredible week of presenters and sessions. It's been absolutely fantastic. So with that, Devin, thanks again so much. We'll talk more about any other presentations you want to do because this was really good stuff.
Hit me up. I'm around.
All right. All right, everybody. We'll see you soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye.